Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I am back with some long-form Appalachian horror stories. In this episode, we will venture deep into the ancient mountains and forgotten hollows of Appalachia, with 7 chilling tales of encounters with forces that defy explanation. Adapted from true events, reported by those who survived to tell their stories. Each narrative has been carefully crafted, drawing from the terrifying experiences of park rangers, loggers, researchers, and locals who claim to have witnessed things in these deep woods that should not exist. From missing hikers who leave impossible tracks to ancient entities disturbed by modern machinery, these accounts span generations of those who have learned why certain places in the mountains carry warnings passed down through bloodlines. To protect the privacy of those involved, some names and details have been altered, but the core experiences remain as they were reported. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to my channel for daily true horror content that explores the darkest corners of our world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the wilderness reveals its most guarded secrets. The official report lies filed away in a dusty cabinet at the U.S. Forest Service office in Sacramento. It's a dry, bureaucratic document about a simple search and rescue mission turned cold case, stripped of everything that might suggest I'd lost my mind. But the real story, the one I carry every day, is about something else entirely. My name is Ethan Miller, and I've been a park ranger in the Pacific Northwest for 18 years. I've handled everything: drug operations, forest fires, cougar encounters, and complex rescue missions in terrain that chews up the unprepared. I thought I was an expert until I was assigned to a remote section of the Redwood National Park in Northern California. The incident began on a Wednesday afternoon in early August, 5 years ago. Dispatch called about 2 hikers, Sarah Jenkins and Mark Peterson, both experienced climbers and backpackers from Seattle. They were overdue after planning a challenging 6-day loop through the coastal highlands. They were supposed to check in at the ranger station on Tuesday evening but never showed. We found their black pickup truck at the Fern Canyon trailhead, exactly where they had parked it. The gear they hadn't taken, spare fuel, coolers, extra dry food, was untouched. I started the search at first light, following the primary route they'd listed on their permit. The Redwood Summit Trail is notoriously difficult, climbing through ancient redwood groves for about 8 miles before intersecting with a network of seldom-used logging paths that lead deeper into the wilderness. About 4 miles in, near a massive fallen redwood that the locals call the Sleeper, I found the first anomaly. The trail crossed a small stream swollen by recent rain, and the muddy banks held clear evidence of their passage. 2 distinct sets of boot prints, a man's and a woman's, matching the size and tread pattern I expected. But mixed in with the human footprints were tracks I had absolutely never seen. They were roughly humanoid, but impossibly long, almost a yard from heel to toe. The impression in the mud showed what appeared to be only 4 toes, each ending in a point that had deeply gouged the earth. Whatever made them was walking upright, but the stride length was monstrous, almost 7 feet between steps. The prints suggested something significantly heavier than a man, yet they showed no sign of a clumsy gait. They were deliberate and purposeful, following the same path the hikers had taken across the stream. I documented the tracks, but I knew my camera wouldn't capture the sense of dread they inspired. Following the trail on the opposite bank, the sign of the hikers faded quickly. A discarded energy bar wrapper, a small piece of blue tent material snagged on a branch, that was it. But the strange elongated tracks continued, sometimes running parallel to the hiking trail, sometimes crossing it, always maintaining that impossible, horrifying stride. A couple of miles past the Sleeper, the official path dissolved into a series of overgrown game trails. Sarah and Mark should have stuck to the main trail, but the tracks I was following, both human and otherwise, led onto the most remote, unmapped eastern track. After another grueling hour, I reached a small, dense clearing. There, I found their campsite. Their small yellow tent was still pitched, but the rainfly was shredded and hung uselessly on a nearby bush. The tent's zipper was shut, but the interior was a mess. Sleeping bags were half pulled out, gear was scattered, and Mark's trekking poles were bent at an unnatural angle. Most chilling was the floor of the tent, which had long, systematic parallel tiers, as if something with razor-sharp claws had raked across the fabric from underneath. I immediately radioed for heavy backup and established a perimeter. While waiting, I closely examined the ground. The impossible tracks were everywhere, circling the camp, approaching from multiple directions, suggesting a systematic, patient stalking behavior. Then, I found drag marks, deep furrows in the soft earth, indicating that something had been pulled, not carried, away from the tent and toward the densest, darkest part of the ancient redwood forest. The trail ended abruptly in a rocky outcrop where the earth was too hard to hold an impression. The official search lasted 10 days and involved over 50 personnel. We found Sarah's rain jacket 4 miles from the campsite, torn and lightly stained with blood. We found Mark's GPS unit even further away, smashed and buried under a deliberately arranged pile of pine needles. But we never found Sarah Jenkins or Mark Peterson. Case was suspended after 2 weeks and remains classified as a presumed wilderness accident. What I never put in my report, what I told only my family, was the pattern that emerged during the search. We repeatedly found the strange tracks, always leading deeper into the uncharted areas. We found odd rock formations and stick structures, patterns too deliberate to be natural, serving no obvious human purpose. And electronic equipment, radios, GPS units, satellite phones, consistently failed in the same small, specific geographic areas. On the final day of the search, working alone in a forgotten sector nearly 8 miles from the original campsite, I found something that made me cancel my mission instantly. Following a faint game trail, I came across what I can only call a collection site. In a natural, bowl-like depression surrounded by massive, ancient redwoods, someone or something had gathered objects that didn't belong. There were pieces of camping equipment from multiple sources, some so weathered they must have been there for decades. Straps, stakes, water bottles, and boots, all arranged in neat, sorted piles. Among these, I recognized Mark's distinctive orange hiking cap and Sarah's metal water filter. Both were placed carefully on a flat central rock, but the horror was in the rest of the collection. I saw tent fabric in colors and patterns that hadn't been manufactured in 30 years, hiking boots from styles out of production since the 1980s, water, bottles bearing the logos of outdoor companies that went out of business long before I became a ranger. It was a graveyard of lost hikers, a museum of the missing, meticulously cataloged by whatever shared the woods with us. I immediately radioed for extraction, marking the location as inaccessible due to extreme terrain hazards. 5 years later, I still patrol the redwood trails, but I avoid the eastern sectors near the sleeper. I redirect any hiker who asks about those old logging paths. On quiet nights, when the wind howls like a mournful cry through the valleys, I review the missing persons reports from the last 50 years. The pattern is always there. Experienced people, vanishing without a trace, leaving behind a campsite that shows signs of a silent, terrifying invasion. I'm due to retire next year, and the location of that collection site will die with me. The eastern trails will remain open, but I sleep better knowing that soon, whatever lurks in those ancient, silent redwoods will be someone else's responsibility to ignore. The saw died mid-cut. That was the first, and should have been the final, warning. My name is Robert "Rob" Mason, and I've worked timber in the Colorado Rockies for almost 2 decades. My great-uncle came west during the gold rush and stayed to log the mountains, passing the trade down through 3 generations. We thought we knew the sound of every creek, the grain of every spruce, and the feel of every ridge from aspen to telluride. We were wrong. The contract came from Monarch Development, a company looking to clear a section of private land deep in the Black Fork Ridge region of southern Colorado. They wanted to harvest the old-growth hardwood before starting construction on a mountain resort. The money was excellent, enough to keep our small crew busy for a full 6 months. The land was hauntingly beautiful. Massive groves of ancient oak and pine that had survived every natural disaster for centuries. Our crew was 4 men. Myself, Gabe Ramirez, our skilled skidder operator, Ben Carter, our feller who could drop a tree on a dime, and young Tyler Davis, barely 20, but already a natural logger. We were a machine. The first week was perfect. Great weather, excellent timber quality, and the equipment hummed. It was during the second week that the mountain began to feel different. The change was subtle, an unnatural quiet. The usual forest chatter, birds, insects, small rodents, faded into a profound silence that made our heavy machinery sound brutally loud. Ben first mentioned it. He was working a remote section of the ridge when his professional-grade saw began sputtering and losing power, despite being perfectly maintained. When Gabe checked it, nothing was mechanically wrong, but the saw kept failing in that specific 100-yard radius. Then Tyler found the markings. While prepping a massive downed oak, he saw strange symbols carved into the trunk about 6 feet up. They were deep, deliberate cuts, forming geometric yet somehow fluid patterns that none of us recognized. They weren't natural, and they weren't the work of forestry officials or hikers. When Tyler tried to photograph them with his phone, the camera glitched, producing only blurred, distorted images. He counted 6 distinct markings arranged in a circle. By the end of the second week, equipment failure was a serious safety hazard. Saws refused to start only when we tried to work near the ridge summit. Our skidder's hydraulics suffered pressure drops that our remote mechanic couldn't diagnose. Even our heavy-duty diesel generator would run fine all day, but instantly die if we tried to run it after sunset. That same week, Ben discovered evidence of previous logging activity. Scattered throughout an untouched area were cut stumps, some easily 50 years old. The cuts were clean and professional, but there was no access road, no skid trail, and no tire tracks showing how any machinery had ever been brought in or taken out. Most puzzlingly, the stumps were arranged in a circular pattern, serving no logical logging purpose. Then Gabe found the abandoned equipment. A chainsaw, a model from the late 1980s, wedged between 2 large rocks near a small creek, about half a mile from our site. It was in remarkable condition, no rust, sharp chain, and the engine turned over easily. What was chilling was the logo. The saw belonged to Ridge Runner Logging, a small local outfit that had vanished in 1997. The crew disappeared without a trace, leaving their trucks and equipment at a staging area just like ours. The official conclusion was they were lost in a sudden whiteout and fell into one of the region's many abandoned mine shafts. Their bodies were never found. Finding their saw, in working condition, 28 years later, raised questions none of us wanted to answer. Friday morning brought the final, contract-ending incident. I was operating my own trusted saw, a powerful machine I'd used reliably for 10 years, attempting to fell a massive 200-year-old red oak that stood alone in a small clearing. The tree was the largest specimen on the property. I made the initial notch cut perfectly. The saw was running smoothly. I moved to the backside to begin the felling cut. That was when the saw died mid-cut. It didn't cough, sputter, or lose power slowly. It simply went silent, instantly, as if someone had pulled a fuse on the forest itself. I nearly lost my balance from the sudden absence of resistance. I tried the pull cord, checked the fuel, everything was fine, but it would not start. Tyler brought over his backup saw. It started and ran until the moment the chain touched the oak. Then it, too, died instantly. Gabe and Ben's saws did the same. We even brought the recovered Ridge Runner saw. It started fine, but died the moment it made contact with the bark. We spent 2 hours troubleshooting. Every saw would start and run until we tried to cut that specific tree. Then we heard the sound. It came from the deep woods, a low, rhythmic, thunderous pounding. It sounded organic, like a massive drum, but with an irregular, deliberate beat. It seemed to come from all directions at once. As we stood there, surrounded by useless equipment, Tyler pointed to the oak. The strange geometric symbols he'd found days before were now appearing on the red oak's trunk. Not being carved, but manifesting, dark. Wet lines that seemed to bleed out from within the wood itself, pulsing with a faint, dark energy. Within minutes, the entire trunk was covered. The drumming grew closer and more intense. Pine needles and small stones on the ground began to vibrate with each beat. And then, our equipment, which had been dead for hours, suddenly roared back to life on its own. Chainsaws started without being touched, running at full throttle. The skidder's engine violently turned over. We didn't hesitate. We dropped everything but our keys and ran for the trucks. We left the skidder, the generators, the entire load of processed timber, and our personal equipment behind, not stopping until we hit the main state highway 30 miles away. When I called Monarch Development to terminate the contract, I was told the development company had filed for bankruptcy a week prior, and no one had authorized any logging operations. I never went back. 6 months later, Gabe drove past the access road and reported that our staging area was completely overgrown, as if it had been abandoned for years. No sign of our massive skidder, no generators, and no processed timber. I still work timber in the mountains, but I've learned a crucial truth. Some forests do not want to be disturbed. Some trees are meant to stand forever, and some warnings should never be ignored. The Ridge Runner crew learned that lesson 28 years ago. We were just lucky enough to hear the second drum beat. I buried this memory so deep, I convinced myself it was a childhood nightmare, until my sister brought it up casually at a Thanksgiving dinner 5 years ago. My name is Jessica Adams, and what I'm about to tell you happened when I was 9 years old, during the summer of 1989. My family had just moved from Miami to a small town in eastern Tennessee, where my father, Mr. Alan Adams, had taken a geology position researching some of the old coal mines in the Appalachian foothills. The move was tough for me and my older sister Chloe, who was 12. To help us adjust, my parents planned a series of weekend camping trips. My father loved the outdoors, believing the wilderness of the Cherokee National Forest would help us bond with our new home. The trip that changed everything was scheduled for the last weekend of August. We planned to spend 3 days at a remote, unlisted location my father found on an old survey map. The access was a narrow, unpaved logging road that wound for 5 miles into the dense forest. There were no facilities and no other visitors. We set up our camp beside a creek my father named Lost River Branch. Chloe, always the explorer, immediately went off to scout. I was more timid, staying close to the familiar comfort of our dark green tents. The forest here was ancient, the trees massive, their canopies so thick that the light filtering down was a dim, sickly green. But it was the silence that settled over me like a shroud. In other forests there was sound. Here there was a heavy, profound quiet. Lost River Branch barely murmured, even after recent rains. On the first evening, around the campfire, Chloe announced her discovery. About half a mile upstream, she'd found the substantial stone remains of an old homestead. Rusted tools and household items were scattered around what looked like a massive, sophisticated stone foundation. My father was intrigued. That night, I had the first of what I now know wasn't a dream. I found myself standing alone at the edge of our campsite in the dead of night. The fire was embers, and my parents' tent was silent. Chloe's sleeping bag next to mine was empty. The silent forest was now filled with sound. Low, murmuring voices just beyond the circle of firelight. Footsteps moved deliberately through the underbrush, and occasionally, I heard the unsettling sound of children laughing. But the laughter was hollow, too old for children. I was frozen. The sounds weren't approaching our camp directly. They were circling it, following an invisible boundary. I tried to scream but couldn't. As they got closer, I realized they weren't speaking English. The language was strange, something guttural and ancient, but somehow I understood them perfectly. They were calling my name. Jessica. Jessica. They were inviting me to join them, promising to show me the truth of the woods. The pull to step into the darkness was almost irresistible. I took one small step away from the tent. Then, Chloe appeared beside me. I have no memory of her waking or leaving the tent. She took my hand without a word and began leading me back toward the camp. As we walked, she spoke in the same ancient language, responding to the voices in the darkness, seemingly defending me from them. Only when we reached the tent entrance did I realize that the Chloe holding my hand vanished like smoke. I rushed inside to find the real Chloe sleeping soundly in her bag. Something with my sister's face had saved me. The next morning, I was convinced it was a nightmare. We hiked to the ruins. The stone foundations were complex and large, suggesting a settlement built to last, possibly in the 1870s. My father was puzzled by the impractical location, no easy farming land, and the complete lack of a road for transporting the heavy stone. Chloe's real discovery came in the main living area, a collection of small, expertly carved wooden figures. They were humanoid, but stylized, elongated, angular, with expressions that were too complex, too dark, for simple folk art. As we left, Chloe made one final secret find. Behind the ruins, a smaller foundation built with stones arranged in a precise, geometric pattern, a large-scale version of the carvings. My father couldn't explain its purpose. That final night, the calling returned with terrifying clarity. I was outside the tent again. The voices were no longer vague. They were right there, speaking directly into my mind. I was drawn out, taking small steps toward the darkness. Suddenly, I felt a physical shove, and the voice of the other Chloe, the protector, screamed in my head. "Stop! Go back!" I rushed back to the tent, terrified. We broke camp early the next morning. My parents never explained why, but I saw my father immediately destroy his notes and sketches of the ruins when we got home. For 30 years, I never spoke of it. Then, at Thanksgiving dinner, Chloe casually mentioned that she had never slept properly at Lost River Branch, because she kept having to get up to bring me back to the tent. She described the sleepwalking incidents, the feeling of something circling the camp, and the voices calling my name, exactly as I remembered. Then she told me the rest. On our final morning, she walked back alone to the homestead to retrieve a small carving she had hidden from our parents. When she arrived, the entire site had vanished. The stone foundations, the artifacts, the smaller carved structure, everything was gone. The forest floor was pristine, showing no sign a structure had ever existed there. Only the familiar Lost River Branch flowed past. She kept the carving she had hidden. But a week after we returned home, the small wooden figure changed. The human form warped into something elongated and monstrous, a visage too disturbing for a 12-year-old to look at. She buried it in our backyard. I am now 45 and a mother. I live far from the Tennessee mountains, but sometimes, when I hear an unnatural quiet in the suburban night, I find myself listening for a low, ancient voice calling my name. And I wonder if the real horror isn't the thing that tried to lure me away, but the thing that wore my sister's face to make sure I came home. My research led me into the archives, and what I found there shattered my understanding of recorded history. My name is Professor Alan Hartwell, and I've spent the last 30 years studying the isolated settlement patterns of European immigrants in the Appalachian Mountains, specifically during the period between 1850 and 1900. My focus is on the small, separatist communities that often developed unique, insular cultures. My most disturbing discovery began innocuously enough in the archives of the Pennsylvania Historical Society. I was reviewing old land-grant records for a book when I found repeated, persistent references to a settlement called Gwynedd Valley. The name was clearly Welsh, but the location was vaguely described as remote highlands or beyond the settled districts. What was truly fascinating was the consistency of its presence across decades of records. Tax rolls, census data, immigration documents, and even Masonic lodge records all mentioned Gwynedd Valley, but none provided a specific locatable map reference. The settlement appeared to maintain a stable population of around 250 residents without any clear economic base or connection to the outside world, a complete violation of every known settlement pattern of the era. The breakthrough came when I discovered the personal papers of Dr. Harrison Blake, a physician who practiced in the mountain regions of Pennsylvania in the late 1870s. Among his journals and correspondence, I found detailed notes describing a visit he made to Gwynedd Valley in the autumn of 1878. Dr. Blake had been summoned by two silent, intense men who appeared at his Philadelphia office, offering a substantial fee to treat a mysterious illness affecting their community. They offered no names and would not describe the illness or their location, only insisting on immediate travel. The journey to Gwynedd Valley took 4 days through increasingly remote mountain terrain. Blake noted his guides used paths unknown to his maps, deliberately avoiding any contact with established roads or towns. When they finally arrived, Blake was shocked. The settlement consisted of about 50 stone houses, arranged around a central common area. The construction was remarkably advanced for such an isolated area, built into the hillsides in a way that rendered them nearly invisible from the valley floor. The agricultural terraces showed sophisticated farming methods, but the people themselves were the true puzzle. They were clearly of Welsh origin, speaking a recognizable but archaic dialect, yet their physical appearance was unsettling. The adults were uniformly tall and exceedingly lean, with translucent pale skin and eyes that Dr. Blake wrote reflected light in a way that reminded me of creatures accustomed to the deepest dark. More disturbingly, he saw no children and only a handful of adults who appeared to be under 40. When he inquired about the young, his questions were deflected with vague answers about seasonal arrangements. The illness he was called to treat was a debilitating wasting sickness, causing rapid weight loss, extreme sensitivity to sunlight, and a bizarre aversion to normal food. The symptoms came in cycles, with periods of recovery followed by severe relapse. Dr. Blake's training could not account for it, and his medicines had no effect. When he asked the leaders about the cause, they simply said it was a seasonal affliction that has been with us since the first stone was laid. On his final evening, Blake made a chilling observation. While eating dinner with a family, none of the residents consumed the meal. They sat and watched him eat, explaining their dietary requirements were different. In 4 days, he never saw a single resident of Gwynedd Valley eat normal food or engage in meal preparation. More disturbing were the sounds that came from the settlement after dark. A low, rhythmic noise, and the sound of large groups of people moving in coordinated fashion through the valley. Yet when Blake looked outside, the settlement was completely deserted. On his final morning, when he tried to create a detailed map of the valley's location, his guides became violently agitated. They physically seized his mapping materials and destroyed his notes, stating that outsiders were not permitted to maintain permanent records of this community's location. The return trip took only 1 day, following roads he was certain they hadn't used on the way in. When he later tried to return to Gwynedd Valley, he couldn't locate any of the landmarks. When he consulted with officials, no one had any record of a Welsh settlement called Gwynedd Valley. According to every official source, the remote valleys he had traveled through were uninhabited wilderness. I discovered Dr. Blake's journal in 2003. Using his descriptions, I spent years trying to locate the valley using modern satellite imagery and geological data. I was successful. In a remote valley in the Appalachian Mountains, I found the ruins of 50 stone structures. Exactly as he described, the ruins were ancient, likely abandoned by the 1920s. There were no artifacts indicating recent habitation. I found a community cemetery containing about 250 graves, with Welsh names and dates spanning from 1855 to 1880. According to these stones, the final burial took place only 2 years after Dr. Blake's visit. I never published my findings. How do you publish a historical truth that contradicts every official document? How do you explain a community that was physically there, yet didn't exist in any census? But sometimes, reviewing Blake's notes, I think about the illness, the aversion to sunlight, the cyclical wasting, the absolute avoidance of food, and the nocturnal activities. His description suggests possibilities that no rational academic should ever consider. I am retiring next year. The location of Gwynedd Valley will remain my secret, and Dr. Blake's journal will return to the archives, waiting for some future researcher who might be better equipped to understand what happens when a community isolates itself so deeply that it leaves the human world behind. In 20 years of search and rescue, I've seen things that would make you swear off the wilderness forever. But this case didn't just break our team, it shattered our reality. My name is Detective Sandra O'Connell, and I lead the Specialized Wilderness Search and Rescue Unit for the State Police in Western North Carolina, covering the Blue Ridge Mountains region. We handle everything from climbing accidents to missing persons cases in the toughest terrain on the East Coast. What we encountered during the Harding family case in November 2021 forced us to abandon every protocol and confront a possibility our training never covered. The initial call came in on a Friday evening. A family of 3 experienced hikers from Raleigh was reported overdue after failing to check in from a routine weekend backpacking trip. The missing persons were Dr. Andrew Harding, a 50-year-old surgeon, his wife Lisa, a 48-year-old nurse, and their 15-year-old daughter Katie, an avid junior explorer. The Hardings planned a 4-day trek through a difficult but well-marked section of the Pisgah National Forest. They had filed a detailed itinerary, carried quality gear, GPS devices, and a satellite phone. When they failed to return home Monday evening, Lisa's sister contacted the authorities. The Hardings were meticulous. Their failure to communicate was a red flag. By Tuesday morning, we launched a full-scale search. We found their SUV at the designated trailhead, locked and undisturbed. They had packed appropriately. The first day's search confirmed they had started their hike. We found boot prints at several trail markers, and a witness at a popular outlook remembered seeing a family matching their description on Saturday morning. But somewhere between the outlook and their planned first night's campsite, they had completely vanished. The terrain was familiar. Rolling, forested hills with marked trails. The weather was ideal. There were no natural hazards. By the fourth day, we had covered every established trail. We used K9 units, helicopters, and expert local guides. Nothing. The breakthrough came on Friday morning. One of our K9 teams picked up a faint scent trail leading sharply away from the established path system, into an area of dense, almost impenetrable rhododendron thickets. The terrain was incredibly challenging, requiring ropes and technical gear. Terrain the Hardings would never have attempted voluntarily. After 3 hours of difficult ascent and descent, the tracking team reached a small, forgotten clearing, roughly 2 miles from the nearest trail. The site had been used as a temporary camp. The fire ring contained the remains of a fire that had burned far hotter and longer than a normal campfire. In the ashes were partially burned fragments of fabric matching the family's clothing descriptions, scattered. Personal items raised immediate questions. Dr. Harding's prescription glasses were found 20 feet from the fire, melted on one side as if exposed to intense heat. Lisa's hiking watch was found at the edge of the clearing, the casing ripped open and the components scorched. Most significantly, Katie's bright orange backpack was hanging from a tree branch a full 12 feet above the ground, far too high to be placed there by human hands. The scent trail continued beyond the clearing, but it changed. Our K9 handlers reported that their dogs, highly trained animals with hundreds of successful missions, became agitated, whining, and refusing to follow the trail any further into the forest. Their fear was palpable. When we continued on foot, we found a path leading to a series of unusual rock formations, a geological maze of narrow passages and hidden chambers leading deep into the mountainside. These caves were unmapped and showed no sign of prior exploration. Inside the largest chamber, about 40 yards from the entrance, we found the Hardings' final campsite. Their tent was still standing but had been systematically damaged. The fabric was torn in long, parallel slashes, too neat and extensive to be a normal bear or coyote attack. The interior was a scene of desperate struggle. Sleeping bags were twisted, pulled half out of the entrance, suggesting they had been dragged out against their will. Personal belongings showed the same heat damage we'd seen outside. But the walls of the chamber provided the most terrifying evidence. Covering nearly every accessible stone surface were frantic messages, scratched deeply into the rock with sharp objects. The handwriting was recognizable as Dr. Harding's, Lisa's, and Katie's. The earliest messages were rational, Dr. Harding documenting their decision to take emergency shelter after becoming hopelessly lost. But they quickly descended into terror. Lisa's writing described whispers and screams coming from the stone walls. Katie's messages spoke of seeing tall, slender shadows moving at the mouth of the cave, always watching. The final messages, all scrawled by Dr. Harding during what must have been their last hours, described an organized, systematic siege on their position by entities he couldn't identify. He wrote of their equipment being violently smashed, and the slow, deliberate approach of whatever was stalking them. The last legible message, scratched near the tent entrance, was a single, horrifying sentence. "They are not the woods, and they are not done with us." We found no trace of the Hardings themselves. No bodies, no blood beyond a few small smudges on the tent, and no other personal effects. The scent trail that led us to the chamber simply ended at the entrance, as if they had been absorbed by the rock itself. The investigation continued for weeks. Federal and academic specialists were brought in. Geologists couldn't explain the unnatural rock formations. Linguists couldn't identify the strange symbols. Not messages, but patterns we found etched around the cave's perimeter. The official file remains open. Presumed accidental death. Missing persons. But I know what I saw. I have been forced to acknowledge a truth that has no place in a police report. In the deepest parts of the Blue Ridge, there are things older than the mountains, and sometimes they decide to collect. This story is less about a single event and more about a pattern, a generational curse laid bare by a forgotten discovery. It's a part of the original Redwood Ranger story I had to separate because it deserves its own place in the darkness. It's about Park Ranger Ethan Miller's final Day on the Sarah Jenkins and Mark Peterson case from the first story. Now set in 1995, 4 years before the main incident in the last story. 5 years before the Harding family vanished. I was a young ranger, Ethan Miller, fresh out of training. In 1995, I was part of a major search operation in the Redwood National Park for an elderly couple, the Wilsons, who'd vanished near the coastal highlands. It was a standard search that went cold fast, but the case left me with a deep, unsettling feeling. On the 12th day, when the operation was winding down, I was assigned to sweep an inaccessible gorge near the Whispering Giant Grove. The search dogs had refused to enter the area, a confusing rejection that my senior partner dismissed as the dogs being fatigued. Working alone, pushing through the densest redwood underbrush, I followed a faint game trail, a deer path, nothing more. It led me into a massive, bowl-shaped natural depression surrounded by towering ancient redwood trees, so enormous they blocked out the midday sun entirely. It was the collection site. In the center of the depression, on a flat slab of black striated rock, was an array of objects that had no business being there. It wasn't a garbage dump. It was a museum of the missing. Objects were arranged in neat, categorized piles of hiking boots, old leather styles from the 70s, new synthetic ones, all placed together. Backpack straps and buckles, sorted by material. Nylon with nylon, leather with leather. Water bottles, metal, plastic, aluminum, arranged almost by color. I recognized items from the Wilsons' missing gear. Mr. Wilson's distinctive, old-fashioned canvas backpack, neatly folded and placed on a pile of similar canvas. Mrs. Wilson's red plastic thermos, sitting with a collection of metal ones. The sheer age of the collection was the real terror. I found the canvas tent fabric in colors and patterns that had not been manufactured since the 1960s. Hiking, boots with logos from companies that went defunct long before I was born. It was a meticulously curated inventory of every person who had ever been lost in this sector of the park, spanning decades. The entity that left those impossible, elongated tracks was not a mindless predator. It was a collector. It was cataloging its victims. The silence in that depression was absolute. I felt intensely, profoundly watched. Every hair on my body stood up. I immediately radioed my supervisor for an emergency extraction, citing a fabricated structural hazard, a sudden, deep fissure in the earth. I didn't mention the objects. I didn't mention the arrangement. I didn't mention the profound understanding that I had stumbled into the private domain of something that didn't just kill people, but collected their remains. The helicopter pulled me out. The official report lists the area as unsearched due to extreme terrain hazards. I ensured the coordinates were marked as inaccessible. I spent the next 2 years of my career studying the missing persons reports for that region. The pattern was undeniable. Experienced hikers disappearing without any explanation in the same general area, their campsites showing signs of systematic disturbance. The lesson I learned in 1995, the knowledge I took to my current post, is that when the forest gets too quiet and the tracks defy nature, you are not dealing with an animal. You are dealing with something ancient, intelligent, and possessive. The wilderness had a keeper, and I had just trespassed into its trophy room. This final short account is the chilling postscript to the Lost River Branch story, Story 3. It shows the terrifying reality of places that simply refuse to exist. This happened in 1998, 4 years after the events at Lost River Branch, and involves Chloe Adams, the sister, who had the unique role of protector against the calling voices. Chloe had carried the burden of that summer night in 1989 for years. She was the one who was awake, who saw the other version of herself, and she was the one who had kept the small, carved wooden figure she had secretly retrieved from the homestead ruin. The change in the carving haunted her. Within 2 weeks of returning to Tennessee, the small human figure had begun to subtly warp. The wood seemed to soften and flow, turning the pleasant folk carving into something with elongated, insect-like limbs and a featureless, terrible face. Chloe, then a preteen, finally buried it deep in the backyard. In 1998, now 21 and home from college for the summer, Chloe felt an urge she couldn't ignore. She needed to go back to Lost River Branch in the Cherokee National Forest to prove her sanity. She told her parents she was taking a day hike on the Long Pine Trail, but she drove straight to the abandoned logging road. She hiked directly to the coordinates she remembered for the old homestead. She found the creek, Lost River Branch, flowing exactly as she remembered. The massive ancient trees formed the same dim canopy. The terrain was unchanged. But when she reached the clearing where the homestead had been, she found nothing. The substantial stone foundations, the large hearth, the scattered 1870s artifacts, the small, geometrically arranged side structure, all were gone. The forest floor was pristine, covered in a uniform layer of pine needles and moss. There was no sign that any structure, large or small, had ever been built there. She searched for over an hour, convinced she had somehow misremembered the location. But Lost River Branch was right there, marking the spot. It wasn't that the ruins had collapsed. It was that the land itself had been wiped clean, as if the homestead had never existed in reality. The profound realization that hit Chloe was this: the place they had camped, the homestead they had explored, the voices they had heard. It was a ghost structure, a temporary, hyper-localized manifestation of something old, something the mountain allowed them to see and interact with, only to erase it the moment they left. The voices were trying to lure a victim into a place that could be deleted from existence. Chloe never told her family about the vanished ruins. She understood that some places in the Appalachians don't follow the rules of time or space. They simply appear, demand a price, and then vanish, leaving behind only a buried, monstrous carving and the lingering memory of a voice calling your name from a place that doesn't exist.